At 23:15 hours on June 15, 1944, Flight Lieutenant Joseph Berry climbed into the cockpit of his de Havilland Mosquito at RAF West Malling in Kent, preparing for a patrol that would test everything he thought he knew about night fighting. Berry was 26 years old, RAF Volunteer Reserve, flying with No. 605 Squadron. His navigator, Flying Officer Donald Gregg, settled into the seat beside him. Together, they had flown 47 operational sorties since D-Day 9 days earlier. But tonight would be different. Tonight, they would be hunting something entirely new. The briefing 30 minutes earlier had been unsettling. Intelligence officers described the target, a pilotless aircraft, 25 feet long, powered by a pulse jet engine carrying 1 ton of high explosive speed, approximately 400 miles per hour. Flight altitude between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. They were launched from sites in northern France aimed at London. The RAF was calling them divers. The Germans called them Vergeltungswaffe 1, Vengeance Weapon 1. Everyone else would soon call them buzz bombs or doodlebugs because of the distinctive sound their pulse jet made. The first V-1 had crossed the English coast 4 days earlier at 04:18 hours on June 13th. It had crashed near Swanscombe in Kent. By June 15th, German launch crews were firing them regularly. That night alone, over 50 V-1s would be launched toward London. The RAF's defensive system was unprepared. Anti-aircraft guns along the coast couldn't track them reliably. Barrage balloons were positioned too close to London to provide early interception. Fighter aircraft were the only immediate solution. But intercepting a small, fast target flying low at night was a problem nobody had properly solved. Berry's Mosquito was a Mark 6 fighter-bomber variant. Twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines producing 1,460 horsepower each. Maximum speed 380 miles per hour at 13,000 feet, armed with 4 20mm Hispano cannons in the nose and 4.303 Browning machine guns. The aircraft was built almost entirely of wood, plywood, and balsa sandwich construction covered with fabric. This made it light, fast, and invisible to German radar, but it also made it fragile. A direct hit from anti-aircraft fire or collision with a target could destroy the aircraft instantly. The Mosquito had been designed for speed and altitude. It excelled at high-level photo reconnaissance and bombing raids. Using it for low-level night interception was improvisation born of necessity. The aircraft's AI Mark 8 radar had a maximum range of only 4 miles under ideal conditions. Against a small target like a V-1, detection range dropped to less than 2 miles. That gave a Mosquito crew approximately 90 seconds from initial radar contact to visual identification, positioning, and attack. 90 seconds to find a target smaller than their own aircraft, flying through darkness at 400 miles per hour, and destroy it before it crossed the coast and headed inland toward London. Berry took off at 2330 hours and climbed to patrol altitude of 5,000 feet. The night was clear, 3/4 moon. Visibility excellent for June ground control vectored him toward a patrol zone 20 miles offshore. His orders were to orbit between Dungeness and Dover, waiting for radar operators on the ground to detect incoming V-1s and provide intercept vectors. The system was primitive. Ground radar could detect the V-1s, but couldn't track them precisely enough to guide fighters to within visual range. Controllers would vector fighters to the general area. Then the crew had to find the target using their own airborne radar. At 23:47 hours, ground control called. Bandit inbound bearing 090, Angels 2, speed 400. Berry turned toward the intercept bearing and descended to 3,000 feet. Gregg activated the AI radar and began searching. The radar scope showed nothing but ground clutter. Berry throttled back to cruising speed, 320 miles per hour too fast, and they would overshoot the target before acquiring it. Too slow, and the V-1 would outrun them. At 23:51 hours, Grigg got a contact. Target bearing 085, range 3 miles, slightly below. Berry adjusted course and began closing. The range decreased. 2 miles, 1.5 miles. At 1 mile, Berry saw it. A small orange flame in the darkness ahead, pulsing rhythmically as the pulse jet fired. The V-1 was flying straight and level at approximately 2,500 feet, heading directly toward the Kent coast. Berry pushed the throttles forward and dove to match altitude. Closing speed was approximately 100 miles per hour. At that rate, he had less than 60 seconds before the V-1 would cross the coast once over land. Shooting it down became more dangerous. If he destroyed it too late, the wreckage would fall on British towns. If the warhead detonated in the air, the blast could damage his own aircraft. He needed to kill it over water. At 800 yards, Berry lined up for a firing pass. The gun sight reticle centered on the pulsing flame. He pressed the firing button. The 4 Hispano cannons fired in sequence, sending a stream of 20mm shells toward the target. Nothing happened. The V-1 continued flying. Berry had misjudged the range or the deflection angle. At 400 miles per hour, both aircraft were moving through space faster than the human brain could easily calculate interception angles. At 500 yards, Berry fired again. This time, sparks erupted from the V-1's fuselage, but it didn't explode. The pulse jet kept firing. The V-1 kept flying. Berry closed to 300 yards and fired a third burst. The V-1's wing disintegrated. The aircraft rolled inverted and plunged toward the sea. Berry pulled up hard and turned away. 5 seconds later, a massive explosion erupted on the water below. The warhead had detonated on impact. Berry climbed back to patrol altitude. The entire engagement had lasted less than 4 minutes from initial radar contact to destruction. Ground control was already vectoring him toward another target. At 0014 hours, Berry intercepted his second V-1 of the night. This one he destroyed with a single burst at 400 yards. At 0041 hours, he got a third. By 0200 hours, Berry and Grigg had destroyed 5 V-1s. They landed at West Malling at 0230 hours, with less than 30 minutes of fuel remaining. The problem was speed. The V-1 flew at approximately 400 miles per hour. The Mosquito's maximum speed at low altitude was 370 miles per hour. Mosquitoes couldn't catch a V-1 from behind in level flight. They had to intercept from above, diving to build up speed. But diving attacks required precise timing. Dive too steeply, and the Mosquito could break apart. Too shallow, and the V-1 would escape across the coast. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont developed the standard intercept procedure: patrol at 8,000 to 10,000 feet above the V-1's altitude. When ground control detected an incoming target, dive to build speed to 450 miles per hour. Position behind and slightly above the V-1, then close to firing range. In practice, this was incredibly difficult at night. Visual acquisition required perfect conditions: clear skies, good moonlight, the V-1's pulse jet flame visible on overcast nights. Crews relied entirely on airborne radar. But the AI Mark 8 was temperamental, frequently losing contact with small targets. The radar operator had to maintain contact long enough for visual identification. Flying Officer Kenneth Collier of No. 96 Squadron discovered another problem on June 17th. He had intercepted a V-1 over the channel and positioned for an attack at 200 yards. He opened fire. The V-1 exploded instantly. The blast wave hit Collier's Mosquito with tremendous force. The windscreen shattered. Both engines failed from debris ingestion. Collier managed to glide back to the coast and crash-land his aircraft on a beach near Dymchurch. He and his navigator survived with minor injuries. The incident established the minimum safe firing range: 300 yards. Closer than that, and the explosion could destroy the attacking aircraft. The Tempest squadrons operating from RAF Newchurch had better success rates initially, The Hawker Tempest Mark V was the fastest piston-engine fighter in RAF service, maximum speed 435 miles per hour. It could catch V-1s in level flight, but Tempests couldn't operate effectively at night without airborne radar. The night defense fell to the Mosquito squadrons. By late June 1944, the RAF had established a defensive system. Anti-aircraft guns were concentrated in a belt along the coast. From Dover to Beachy Head, fighters patrolled seaward of the gun belt. Barrage balloons were positioned in a belt closer to London. Any V-1 that made it past the fighters and guns would hopefully hit the balloon cables and crash. The system was imperfect. Many V-1s penetrated all three defensive layers. Between June 13th and June 30th, approximately 2,000 V-1s were launched. Roughly 1,000 crossed the coast. About 400 reached London. Each one that got through killed an average of 2.5 people and destroyed or damaged dozens of buildings. The psychological impact was severe. V-1 attacks were continuous, day and night, without warning. Londoners could hear the pulse jet approaching. When the engine cut out, they had approximately 15 seconds before impact. Civil defense couldn't provide effective warnings. The V-1 campaign forced over 1 million Londoners to evacuate. Churchill considered it the second most dangerous period after the Battle of Britain. Flight Lieutenant John Quinton of No. 456. Squadron Royal Australian Air Force developed the most successful Mosquito technique through systematic experimentation. Quinton was an unusual pilot. Before the war, he had worked as a mathematics teacher in Sydney. He approached the V-1 interception problem methodically, treating it as a ballistics calculation. He measured closing speeds, deflection angles, optimal firing ranges. He calculated that the ideal attack position was from directly astern, slightly elevated, at exactly 350 yards range. At that distance, the cannon shells had sufficient time to reach the target, but the explosion wouldn't damage his aircraft. Quinton trained his navigator, Flight Lieutenant Sid Bell, to maintain precise radar contact throughout the attack. Bell would call out range continuously. 400 yards, 375, 350, fire now. Quinton would fire a 3-second burst exactly when Bell called the range. This systematic approach gave them the highest success rate in their squadron. Between June and August 1944, Quinton and Bell destroyed 23 V-1s. They never suffered damage from explosions. They never lost radar contact during an attack. Mathematics worked. The Germans knew the RAF was intercepting their V-1s, but couldn't do much about it. Increasing the V-1's speed required more fuel, which reduced range. Launching them at higher altitudes made them easier to detect. Launching at lower altitudes increased the risk of crashing into terrain or the channel. The V-1's design was intentionally simple. Minimal guidance, crude aerodynamics, cheap construction. It was meant to be launched in massive numbers. Overwhelming defenses through quantity rather than sophistication. The Fieseler V-103, the V-1's official designation, had been designed by Robert Lucer at Fieseler Aircraft Company. The pulse-jet engine had been developed by Argus Motoren. The entire weapon cost approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks to produce, roughly the cost of a high-quality motorcycle. Germany could build 25 V-1s for the cost of one conventional bomber. If even 10% reached their targets, the cost-effectiveness was favorable compared to manned bomber raids that were suffering 5% to 10% losses per mission over England. The pulse jet was brilliantly simple, a tube with shutters at the front. Fuel was sprayed into the combustion chamber. Air entered through the shutters. The mixture ignited. The explosion closed the shutters and forced exhaust out the rear, creating thrust. The shutters reopened due to the partial vacuum created by the exhaust. More air entered. The cycle repeated 50 times per second, creating the characteristic buzzing sound. The engine had no moving parts, except the shutters. It required no lubrication, no cooling system, minimal maintenance. It could run on low-grade fuel. The downside was inefficiency and short lifespan. Most pulse jets failed after approximately 30 minutes of operation, but the V-1 only needed to fly for 22 minutes to reach London from launch sites near Calais. The Luftwaffe tried to defend V-1 launch sites from RAF intruder attacks but had limited success. Mosquito squadrons conducted regular night attacks against launch ramps and storage sites in France. The Mosquito was too fast for German Me-100s and Ju-88s night fighters. The greater danger came from flak protecting the launch sites. The V-1 warheads were remarkably stable, absorbing substantial damage without exploding. Small caliber rounds would punch through without triggering detonation. Only structural hits or direct warhead strikes caused immediate destruction. Some pilots aimed for the pulse jet's fuel tank behind the engine intake, which usually caused fire and explosion. But the pulse jet was only 2 feet in diameter, difficult to hit at night while both aircraft traveled at 400 miles per hour. By August 1944, the RAF's interception rate had improved dramatically. In June, fighters destroyed approximately 15% of V-1s that crossed the coast. By August, the rate had climbed to over 60%. The improvement came from experience, better tactics, and increased numbers of fighter sorties squadrons were flying around the clock. Pilots like Joseph Barry were completing 2 or 3 sorties per night. Ground controllers had learned to vector fighters more efficiently. Radar operators had improved their tracking skills. The entire defensive system was functioning as an integrated whole. The anti-aircraft guns were repositioned in late July to Romney Marsh, creating a concentrated gun belt between the fighters offshore and the balloon barrage protecting London. The guns used proximity-fused shells that detonated within 70 feet of targets. Against the V-1's predictable flight path, these proved devastatingly effective. By late August, guns were destroying more V-1s than fighters. The final V-1 launch against England occurred on March 29, 1945, from the Netherlands. Allied ground forces had overrun most French launch sites. The V-1 campaign failed to achieve strategic objectives. Approximately 6,000 people were killed, 18,000 seriously injured, and over 25,000 buildings destroyed. Joseph Barry survived the war. He was promoted to squadron leader in September 1944 and commanded No. 605 Squadron until the unit converted to Mosquito Mark 30 fighter bombers in early 1945. He participated in Operation Deadlight, the post-war operation to destroy captured German U-boats. Barry left the RAF in 1946 and returned to civilian life in Scotland. He rarely discussed his V-1 kills. When asked years later, he said the missions had been terrifying. Flying low at night, chasing something that could barely see, trying to shoot it before it crossed the coast. Every patrol carried the knowledge that if you failed, people in London would die. That pressure was worse than facing German fighters. Against fighters, you could maneuver, fight back, survive through skill against V-1s. It was just mathematics and luck. Get the intercept angles right. Fire at the correct range. Hope the warhead didn't explode too close. Donald Gregg, Barry's navigator, received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his work during the V-1 campaign. The citation noted his exceptional skill in maintaining radar contact under difficult conditions, enabling his pilot to achieve multiple successful intercepts. Gregg remained in the RAF after the war, eventually retiring as wing commander in 1962. He worked in radar development at the RAF Technical College, helping train the next generation of radar operators. The Mosquito squadrons that fought the V-1 campaign received less recognition than the fighter squadrons that defended Britain during the Battle of Britain. There were no famous names, no glamorous dogfights, no dramatic radio transmissions. It was unglamorous work. Patrol in darkness for hours, chase a target you could barely detect, destroy it with a few seconds of gunfire, return to base, refuel, repeat. Night after night through the summer of 1944. But the work was essential. Every V-1 destroyed over the Channel was one that didn't reach London. Every successful interception saved lives. Military historians studying the V-1 campaign identified several factors that prevented it from succeeding. First, the Germans started it too late. If V-1 launches had begun in early 1943, before the RAF developed effective countermeasures, the impact would have been much greater. Second, the launch sites were too concentrated. The Allies knew where they were and could attack them consistently. Third, the Germans underestimated how quickly the RAF would develop interception techniques. Fourth, British intelligence had advance warning through ultra-decrypts and agent reports, allowing preparations before the first launch. But the critical factor was the skill and determination of pilots like Joseph Barry and navigators like Donald Gray. They took an aircraft designed for other missions and adapted it to hunt targets at night in conditions where mistakes killed instantly. They developed tactics through trial and error. They flew sortie after sortie despite fatigue, despite knowing that one error in judgment would send them into the channel or into the fireball of an exploding V-1. They did this not for glory or recognition, but because Londoners were dying, and someone had to stop it. The technical specifications of the V-1 seem almost quaint now: a pulse jet producing 660 pounds of thrust, a 1,870-pound Amitol warhead, a gyroscopic compass for guidance, maximum range of 150 miles, no evasive capability, no defensive armaments, no ability to respond to threats. By modern standards, it was a crude weapon. But in June 1944, it represented a terrifying new form of warfare. Automated weapons that required no pilot, no crew, no recovery. Just launch them and let them fly until they hit something. The psychological implications were profound. If weapons could operate without human control, what did that mean for the future of warfare? The Mosquito proved to be the ideal counter to the V-1. It was fast enough to catch them if flown correctly. It had the firepower to destroy them. It had radar for night operations, and it had two-man crews who could share the workload of navigation, radar operation, and visual searching single-seat fighters like the Spitfire and Typhoon could chase V-1s in daylight but struggled at night. The Mosquito's two-crew configuration made night operations sustainable. The aircraft itself was remarkable. Built of wood to conserve aluminum for other aircraft, the Mosquito was stronger than expected and faster than most contemporary designs. The wooden construction made it resistant to radar detection. The twin-engine configuration provided redundancy. Losing one engine didn't mean immediate loss of the aircraft. The armament of 4 20mm cannons and 4 machine guns gave it devastating firepower. De Havilland designed an exceptional aircraft, and the RAF found uses for it that designers never anticipated. After the war, several Mosquito pilots who fought the V-1 campaign were asked about their most memorable intercept. Most couldn't identify a single mission. The sorties blurred together into a continuous experience of darkness, engine noise, radar screens, brief moments of violence, and the constant anxiety of knowing they had perhaps 90 seconds to succeed, or London would suffer another strike. The individual missions weren't memorable. The cumulative experience was. Months of night patrols, hundreds of intercept attempts, the ones that succeeded and the ones that didn't, all merging into a collective memory of fighting something that felt unstoppable but somehow was stopped. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. It helps more people discover these important pieces of history. Subscribe to stay connected with stories of the aircraft and crews that operated in darkness during the Second World War. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, united by interest in the real stories of courage and innovation from history's greatest conflict. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering those who served.